3 hours before the biggest acquisition in our company's history, I got the call that my father was in emergency surgery. I asked for exactly 72 hours of leave. My boss looked right through me. Every family has issues, but this contract waits for no one. What he did not know was that the core asset they were selling never truly belonged to them. That night, I stopped crying and decided to take everything back. My name is Cassidy Edwards. I am 38 years old, and I am the Senior Director of Systems Integrity at Halbrecht Mobility Systems, or, at least, I was. Halbrecht is a massive transportation technology conglomerate anchored right in the beating heart of Dallas, Texas. For 3 long years, I gave them my weekends, my holidays, and my sanity. My job was not just to fix things, it was to build the architecture that kept the entire corporate machine from collapsing under its own weight. I was the one who saw the systemic flaws before they became catastrophic failures. But the one catastrophic failure I never modeled in my risk assessments was the absolute moral bankruptcy of the people I worked for. The morning it all shattered was supposed to be a historic victory. The 42nd floor of our glass and steel tower was buzzing with that specific, high-octane adrenaline that only comes when hundreds of millions of dollars are changing hands. We were in the final, grueling hours of signing a massive acquisition deal with Merrow Vale Transport Group. This was not just a routine merger. This was a colossal buyout, and the undisputed crown jewel of the transaction was the proprietary route coordination platform I had architected from scratch. It was my code, my logic, my sleepless nights that they were packaging up and selling. Without my platform, Halbrecht was just another logistics company with aging trucks. With my platform, they were the future of global mobility. The executives were already picking out their vacation homes on the Amalfi Coast, based on their projected bonuses. I was standing in the corridor outside the main executive boardroom, taking a slow, deep breath to center myself before the final review, when my phone vibrated in the pocket of my blazer. I glanced at the screen. It was an incoming call from Redstone Memorial Hospital over in Fort Worth. A hard, cold knot instantly formed in the pit of my stomach. My mother had passed away the year before, and since then, my father, Thomas Edwards, had been a fragile shadow of the man he used to be. I answered the phone, pressing it tight against my ear to drown out the celebratory chatter echoing down the hall. The voice on the other end belonged to a triage nurse. Her tone was flat, rushed, and terribly clinical. She told me that my father had collapsed in his kitchen. An ambulance had brought him in, and the scans showed a ruptured brain aneurysm. He was being prepped for emergency surgery at that exact moment. The nurse did not offer false hope. She told me the situation was critical and that I needed to get there immediately. I thanked her, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger, and hung up the phone. The world tilted on its axis. The buzzing energy of the corporate office suddenly felt utterly meaningless. The hundreds of millions of dollars, the acquisition, the route coordination platform, all of it turned to dust in my hands, compared to the image of my father lying unconscious on a surgical table 30 miles away. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. The air inside was thick with the scent of dark roast coffee and expensive leather. The entire C-suite was gathered around the massive mahogany table. Miles Henshaw, the chief operating officer and my direct superior, was standing at the head of the table, holding a laser pointer and a smug expression. When I walked in, I did not apologize for interrupting. I walked straight up to the edge of the table. I kept my posture rigid, my voice steady, and my emotions locked down in a steel box. I refused to break down in front of these men. My father has just suffered a ruptured aneurysm, I stated, my words clipping through the air like ice. He is being taken into emergency surgery at Redstone Memorial right now. I am taking 72 hours of immediate family leave. I will be driving to Fort Worth. I expected a nod. I expected a brief expression of sympathy, a quick dismissal, a simple instruction to hand over my tablet to my second-in-command. Instead, Miles Henshaw lowered his laser pointer. He looked at me, not with shock or compassion, but with profound, undisguised irritation. He sighed, Adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt as if my dying father was a minor logistical inconvenience he now had to manage. "No," Miles said flatly. "You are not taking 72 hours. We are signing the Marrow Vale deal today. You are the chief architect of the platform. You need to be here, in the building." "I can hand off the operational dashboard to my lead engineer," I replied, forcing my voice to remain even. "My father is in emergency brain surgery. I am leaving." Miles leaned forward, planting his hands flat on the polished wood. "Cassidy, I am not asking you, I am telling you. You will stay on call 24/7 until the ink is dry on this contract. You can go sit in the hallway, you can go pace in the lobby, but you will not leave this campus, and you will answer your phone the second I ring. We cannot afford a single technical glitch today." The sheer audacity of his demand sucked the oxygen right out of the room. I looked around the table at the other executives. Dana Pike, the chief integration officer, suddenly found her cuticles fascinating. Wes Talbot, the general counsel, was busy examining a spot on the ceiling. Not a single person spoke up. Not one of them had the basic human decency to tell Miles he was crossing a line. Then, Miles delivered the fatal blow. He straightened his tie, looked me dead in the eye, and spoke the words that would ultimately seal his own destruction. "Family emergencies do not move markets. Cassidy, we do." The room went dead quiet. In that span of 5 seconds, a profound shift occurred inside my mind. The blinders fell away. This was not a dispute over paid time off. This was a stark, brutal declaration of my worth. They did not see me as a human being with a family, a life, or a soul. They saw me as a highly efficient, entirely replaceable engine part. I was the brain that kept their golden goose alive, but I was not a person. They were willing to hold me hostage with my career while my father fought for his life. Before I could even process the complete magnitude of his cruelty, Miles slid a thick linen paper folder across the table toward me. He tapped a silver pen against the signature line. "Since you are so eager to leave," Miles said, his voice dripping with condescension, "sign this technical certification right now. It is the final sign-off for the intellectual property transfer. Sign it, and I will consider letting you work remotely from the hospital waiting room." I looked down at the document. It was a standard technical release, but my professional intuition, honed over years of navigating corporate minefields, suddenly flared violently. Something was wrong. They were rushing this. They were using my absolute panic, my desperation to get to the hospital, as a lever to force my signature on a document I had not had the time to read thoroughly. They wanted me blind, distracted, and compliant. I did not touch the pen. I did not touch the folder. I looked at Miles Henshaw. Really looked at him, seeing the greed sweating out of his pores. "No," I said quietly. I turned my back on the chief operating officer. I turned my back on the general counsel and the chief integration officer. I walked toward the glass doors. "If you walk out that door, Cassidy, do not bother coming back," Miles barked, his voice finally losing its polished edge. "We will close this deal without you." I did not stop. I did not look back. I walked out of the boardroom, down the long carpeted corridor, and straight toward the elevators. The silence ringing in my ears was deafening. I pressed the button, the polished steel doors slid open, and I stepped inside. As I turned around, the doors began to close, slicing off my view of the frosted glass walls and the arrogant men sitting behind them. I did not cry. I did not shake with rage. As the elevator began its rapid descent toward the ground floor, my mind went completely still. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had forced me to choose between my livelihood and my family. They thought I was walking away empty-handed, sacrificing my career for my father. But they were wrong, dead wrong. Because in their arrogant rush to secure their hundreds of millions of dollars, they had forgotten one crucial, fatal detail. They had forgotten who actually built the system they were selling. They had forgotten who held the keys. This was not the moment I lost everything. As the elevator hit the lobby level, my tears dried up completely. This was the moment I remembered exactly what belonged to me, and exactly how I was going to take every single piece of it back. The drive from Dallas to Fort Worth usually takes about 45 minutes if the traffic on Interstate 30 is merciful. Today, the asphalt stretching out before my windshield felt like an endless gray ribbon. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my sedan so tightly my knuckles turned white, the rhythmic thumping of the tires acting as a metronome for my racing thoughts. My father was under the knife. Every mile marker passing by was a reminder of the fragile line between life and death. But beneath the raw, suffocating fear for my dad, another emotion was taking root. It was a cold, calculating clarity. To understand how Miles Henshaw and the rest of the executive board made such a fatal miscalculation, you have to understand how they viewed me. I was not born into their world of country clubs and legacy admissions. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Ohio, the daughter of a mechanic and a public school teacher. I did not have a flashy Ivy League pedigree. I clawed my way up from the trenches of basic systems engineering, writing code in windowless server rooms and debugging legacy networks until my eyes burned. Over the years, I developed a very specific, highly lucrative niche. I could look at a massive, tangled web of software architecture and instantly see the legal liabilities hidden inside the code. I understood where digital infrastructure intersected with federal compliance, and more importantly, I knew how to build the bridges between them. Long before Halbrecht Mobility Systems ever knew my name, I ran my own independent consulting firm. It was during those grueling, bootstrapped years that I built Harborglass. Harborglass was not just a basic routing software. It was an incredibly complex, predictive core engine designed for routing and compliance reconciliation. It could process millions of logistical data points in real time, ensuring that every truck, every route, and every driver adhered to shifting state and federal regulations without sacrificing efficiency. It was a masterpiece of systems architecture, and I owned every single line of its code. When Halbrecht came knocking 3 years ago, they were a bloated, struggling transport company desperate to modernize. They saw Harborglass and knew it was the lifeline they needed to dominate the market, but they did not have the capital to buy the platform outright. So, we negotiated. We signed a very specific, meticulously drafted contract. They did not purchase Harborglass, they licensed it. The agreement included a structured licensing fee, a substantial grant of deferred equity, and an ironclad inventor credit cementing my ownership. The promise was simple. Once the company stabilized and expanded, the equity would vest, and the intellectual property buyout would be finalized. But corporate promises are written in disappearing ink. As soon as Harborglass was integrated and the company's valuation began to skyrocket, the narrative inside the executive suite began to shift. Miles Henshaw and his inner circle orchestrated a slow, deliberate campaign of amnesia. When I brought up the deferred equity, there was always a perfectly polished excuse. We need to wait until the end of the fiscal year. We need to secure this next round of funding first. We cannot dilute the cap table just yet. Slowly, insidiously, they stopped referring to Harborglass as a licensed product. In board meetings, in pitch decks, and in internal memos, it suddenly became our proprietary in-house engine. They started taking credit for Harborglass, while I was the one who built it and kept it running. A younger, more reckless version of me would have burned the building down the first time they delayed my equity grant. But life has a way of stripping away your appetite for warfare. Last year, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The hospital bills piled up. The hospice care drained my savings. And watching the woman who raised me slowly fade away broke something fundamental inside me. When she passed, my father simply stopped fighting. His health deteriorated rapidly, leaving me as his sole caretaker and financial support. I needed the premium health insurance Halbrecht provided. I needed the steady 6-figure salary. I was too exhausted by grief to wage a multi-year legal war against a corporate giant with a bottomless litigation budget. So, I swallowed my pride. I kept my head down. I played the role of the diligent, compliant senior director, fixing their messes and ensuring the systems never went offline. They mistook my exhaustion for submission. They mistook my silence for stupidity. Because they only saw me as a risk manager, a highly paid janitor who cleaned up their technical spills. They never bothered to read the foundational architecture of my contract. The executives at Halbrecht were obsessed with velocity. They loved the thrill of the deal, the handshake, the aggressive expansion. They despised the tedious, granular details of compliance. None of them, not even Wes Talbot in all his general counsel arrogance, had ever deeply analyzed the original licensing addendums I forced them to sign 3 years prior. If they had, they would have found the failsafe. When I drafted the Harbor Glass agreement, I anticipated the exact kind of corporate greed I was currently experiencing. I built a legal fence around my intellectual property. The contract explicitly stated that if Halbrecht Mobility Systems ever attempted to use Harbor Glass in a change of control transaction, such as a massive corporate buyout, while concurrently misrepresenting the ownership of the software, an automatic trigger would engage. This was not a malicious virus. This was not a time bomb or an act of digital sabotage. It was a perfectly legal, contractually binding restriction mechanism managed by an independent escrow counsel. If the company claimed they owned the asset fully when they did not, the escrow counsel was legally obligated to shift Harbor Glass into restricted use mode. It was designed specifically to prevent my life's work from being swallowed whole in a shady, undocumented merger. As I merged onto Interstate 35 West, gripping the wheel, the events of the morning finally locked into a coherent, terrifying picture. The rush, the hostility, the document Miles shoved across the table. The technical certification he demanded I sign before leaving the building was not a routine sign-off. My professional intuition had been right. That document was the final piece of the puzzle they needed to completely overwrite my inventor credit and nullify my deferred equity just hours before the Marrow Vale Transport Group signed the final papers. They were preparing to hand over Harbor Glass to the buyers, claiming it was 100% company-owned property, a work made for hire. They were not just denying my leave out of cruelty. They needed me in the building, under their thumb, intimidated and distracted by my father's medical emergency, so I would sign away my leverage without reading the fine print. The Marrow Vale deal, a transaction worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was entirely built on a lie. Halbrecht was selling a house they did not own, and they were trying to forge the deed on the closing date. I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was just past 10 in the morning. The closing ceremony with Marrow Vale was scheduled for later this afternoon. Miles Henshaw thought he had won. He thought he had successfully bullied the quiet, grieving engineer into submission. He thought my absence from the boardroom meant a smooth, undisputed victory. He was about to learn that the person who built the system still controlled what happened next. I kept my foot pressed firmly on the gas pedal. The hospital drawing closer. My mind already drafting the exact sequence of legal and technical commands I was going to execute the moment I opened my laptop. The elevator doors were a fraction of an inch from sealing shut when a hand wedged between them. The metal panels groaned, reversed, and slid open to reveal the breathless assistant of our general counsel. He looked panicked, chest heaving, holding a single slip of paper. He told me I was required in meeting room 2B on the second floor immediately. Not requested, required. I considered walking past him, but a cold, heavy instinct anchored my feet. I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to go. I followed the assistant to the second floor. Room 2B was affectionately known among the staff as the interrogation box. It was a small, windowless space tucked behind the main servers, usually reserved for firing mid-level managers. The air conditioning in there always ran 5 degrees colder than the rest of the building. When I stepped inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The door clicked shut behind me with a heavy, final thud. Sitting across the narrow table were 3 people: Miles Henshaw, Dana Pike, and Wes Talbot. They sat shoulder to shoulder, a unified front of corporate executioners. There was no preamble. Wes Talbot did not even offer a fake apology about my family situation. He simply slid a single, stapled document across the polished surface. It was not the bulky technical certification Miles had tried to force on me upstairs. It was a new, highly specific legal addendum. "Sit down, Cassidy," Miles commanded, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. I remained standing. I picked up the document. The glaring, bold header read, "Intellectual Property Reclassification and Retroactive Assignment." I scanned the first paragraph, my eyes darting over the dense legalese. Two phrases jumped off the page, burning themselves into my retinas. The first was, "work made for hire." The second was, "full, unencumbered, and unconditional corporate ownership." The trap was fully sprung. This was the last-minute legalization they desperately needed. They were trying to wipe my inventor credit clean off the ledger. They were attempting to erase the deferred equity that was legally promised to me. They were retroactively rewriting history to claim that I had built my core engine entirely on company time, with company resources, and that I had zero individual claim to it. They needed this signed before the buyers reviewed the final data room. "This is an intellectual property surrender," I said, my voice dangerously soft. I kept my eyes fixed on the paper so they would not see the absolute disgust radiating from them. Miles let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "It is a housekeeping measure. Marrow Vale wants clean lines of ownership. We are simply clarifying what is already understood by the board. You are a senior director. What you build belongs to us." "That is not what my employment contract states," I fired back, finally looking up to meet his gaze. Dana Pike leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table and lacing her fingers together. She wore a perfectly tailored designer suit and an expression of manufactured pity. "Cassidy, we all know you are under a tremendous amount of stress right now. Your father is very ill. We want to help you." She paused, letting the silence hang heavily in the small room. "But you have to help us. Think of your trajectory here. We are doing leadership reviews at the end of Q3. It would be incredibly difficult for me to advocate for your position or your compensation package if the record shows you abandoned the executive team during the most critical transaction of the decade." The threat was not even veiled. "Sign the paper, or your career is over." "You are threatening my job because I need to go to the hospital," I stated clearly, wanting the words spoken aloud in the room. Wes Talbot cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He was the architect of this legal ambush, yet he could not quite look me in the eye. "No one is threatening anyone," Wes said, his tone slick and evasive. "We are merely outlining the optics of the situation. In the eyes of the acquiring board, refusing to sign a standard housekeeping document makes you look uncooperative at a highly sensitive time. It flags you as a potential liability. We are trying to protect you from that categorization." I stared at the general counsel. The sheer cowardice of his phrasing was staggering. He was using the phantom judgment of the acquiring company to execute a theft he had engineered himself. Miles saw that the intimidation was not working fast enough. He decided to switch tactics, offering what he genuinely believed was a generous concession. "Listen to me carefully," Miles said, his voice dropping an octave, adopting the tone of a benevolent dictator. "If you sign that addendum right now, I will personally authorize a remote work exception for you. I will not grant you the 72 hours of leave, but I will allow you to take your company laptop to the hospital. You can sit in the waiting room, you can be near your father, as long as you remain logged into the server and available to answer any technical queries from Marrow Vale. That's my final and strongest offer." He believed he was extending me a way out. In truth, he was tightening the trap around himself. He was demanding I hand over millions of dollars of my own intellectual property, forfeit my life's work, and in exchange, he would grant me the privilege of working from a sterile hospital corridor while my father was in surgery. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. I looked at Dana, with her calculated, hollow empathy. I looked at Wes, hiding behind his legal jargon. And I looked at Miles, a man so blinded by his own ambition that he had completely lost his grip on basic humanity. I placed the document gently back onto the table. I did not throw it. I did not crumple it. I aligned its edges perfectly parallel with the edge of the wood. My father is currently being wheeled into an operating theater, I said, every word articulated with absolute frigid precision. I will not read, review, or sign any documents pertaining to intellectual property rights today. Furthermore, I am leaving this building. Miles Henshaw's face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The benevolent dictator act vanished instantly. He slammed his hand flat against the table, the sharp crack echoing off the windowless walls. "If you step out of this room without signing that document," Miles declared, his voice a harsh, low growl that filled the confined space, "we will consider it a hostile act. If you walk out that door, you are done. The company will handle the integration without you. We do not need you." He said it loudly, ensuring both Dana and Wes could serve as witnesses to his executive decree. He was officially drawing the line in the sand. That was the breaking point. It was not a break of sorrow, or fear, or submission. It was the snapping of the final thread of loyalty I held for Halbrecht Mobility Systems. For 3 years. I had believed that if I worked hard enough, if I was indispensable enough, they would eventually honor their promises. But standing in that freezing room, the reality crystallized with absolute perfection. They were never going to pay me. They were never going to recognize my ownership. They were actively weaponizing my personal tragedy, using my sheer panic over my father's survival as a crowbar to pry my assets from my hands. They did not just want to deny my humanity, they wanted to profit from it. I looked at the three of them one last time. "Understood," I said softly. I turned around, grasped the cold metal handle of the door, and walked out. I did not look back as the heavy door slammed shut, sealing them inside their own impending destruction. The surgical waiting area on the 4th floor of Redstone Memorial Hospital was a sterile purgatory. It smelled of heavy-duty bleach and stale vending machine coffee. Aside from a sleeping man slumped in a corner chair, I was entirely alone. My laptop was open, resting heavily on my knees, the harsh pale blue light from the screen reflecting in my eyes. Just beyond the double doors at the end of the hall, a team of neurosurgeons was drilling into my father's skull. Every time a nurse walked past, my heart hammered against my ribs, anticipating the worst news possible, but amidst the suffocating, helpless terror of waiting, my mind required a focal point to keep from shattering completely. I found that focal point in the glowing lines of code and the secure corporate network I was still, inexplicably, tethered to. I routed my connection through a secure virtual private network and accessed the master merger and acquisition data room. This was the highly restricted digital vault, where Halbrecht and Marrow Vale were exchanging the final, verified documents before the ink dried on the acquisition. I had top-tier administrative clearance, a privilege the executives had likely forgotten to revoke in their frantic rush to pop the champagne. I navigated directly to the intellectual property exhibit folders. The directory loaded instantly. I clicked on the final compliance index, and there it was. The legal addendum they had tried to force feed me in that freezing interrogation room was sitting right there in the approved folder. The status icon next to the file name glowed a solid, damning green, indicating it had been officially submitted to the buyer's legal counsel. I opened the file metadata. They had not forged my physical signature. Even Wes Talbot was not that legally suicidal. Instead, they had appended a fabricated executive summary, claiming that the creator of the software formally acknowledged the platform as a work made for hire, bypassing the need for a direct signature under a manufactured emergency exemption clause. It was a brazen, desperate lie, but it was the next file in the directory that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the technical certification, the document guaranteeing that the core engine was structurally sound and legally cleared for full architectural transfer. It was uploaded and verified. I checked the digital signature attached to the verification. It carried my name, but when I ran a quick terminal script to trace the cryptographic authentication, the truth unspooled across my screen in stark white text. They had not hacked my current credentials. Instead, someone in the infrastructure team, undoubtedly acting under direct orders from Miles, had dug into the obsolete system archives. They had resurrected an old, deprecated approval token, a digital key assigned to my profile, that had been officially retired over 8 months ago. They used a dead token to ghost sign the most critical technical document of the entire transaction. This was no longer just a breach of contract or an aggressive corporate negotiation. It was systemic fraud. They were actively lying to a publicly traded buyer, using my identity to rubber stamp a rigged deck. A lesser person might have slammed the laptop shut. A different woman might have drafted a scorching, profanity-laced email to the entire company directory, or perhaps logged directly into the server to start deleting production databases out of blind, roaring grief. But I am a systems architect. I build structures designed to withstand catastrophic failure. I do not throw tantrums. I execute protocols. I was going to dismantle their entire empire, and I was going to do it with cold, meticulous legality. I opened a new, encrypted communication channel. I did not target Miles, or Dana, or Wes. They were merely symptoms of the disease. I targeted the immune system of the transaction itself. I began compiling the payload. First, I attached the original, countersigned licensing agreement from 3 years ago, highlighting the specific carve-out clauses defining Harbor Glass as my sole intellectual property. Next, I pulled down the complete archive of internal communications, dozens of emails between myself, the chief operating officer, and the general counsel over the last 36 months. These were the digital receipts of their endless delays, their explicit acknowledgments of my deferred equity, and their repeated documented promises to finalize the buyout. Finally, I attached the terminal log, proving that the technical certification uploaded to the data room was validated using a revoked, fraudulent security token. I addressed the message to the senior partners at the independent escrow firm in New York, the neutral third party legally responsible for holding the software assets until the deal cleared. I added the lead merger and acquisition attorneys representing Marrow Vale Transport Group to the carbon copy line. I kept the body of the message brutally short, devoid of any emotional language. To the acting escrow counsel and representing partners, please find attached immutable documentation proving prior and unreleased intellectual property claims regarding the routing engine currently listed in the seller's asset schedule. Furthermore, please see attached server logs indicating the seller has utilized fraudulent, deprecated authentication tokens to verify technical readiness. Pursuant to the governing master license agreement, these actions constitute a material breach and misrepresentation of ownership. I hovered my finger over the trackpad. I thought about Miles telling me that my family emergency did not move markets. I thought about the sheer, arrogant certainty in his eyes when he told me I was entirely replaceable. I pressed send. The packet of data vanished into the ether, traveling at the speed of light to the servers on the East Coast. But I was not finished. Sending the emails was just ringing the alarm bell. Now, I had to lock the vault. I opened the back-end command terminal for Harbor Glass. I did not have to write a new virus or deploy malicious code. The mechanism was already there, sleeping quietly in the foundation of the architecture, waiting for the precise conditions of betrayal to wake it up. According to the covenants established in the very first year of my employment, if there was verifiable evidence that the company was misrepresenting ownership during a change of control event, or if they bypassed standard security protocols to force a deployment, a specific fail-safe could be triggered. I initiated the sequence. The terminal prompted me for my master override credentials. I typed them in. A final warning flashed on the screen, asking for confirmation to shift the entire ecosystem into restricted compliance mode. Restricted compliance mode was not sabotage. It was a legal lockdown. It left current operations intact, but it froze new routes, new features, and any external integration until the ownership dispute was resolved. I typed the word confirm and hit the return key. The terminal cascaded with lines of green text as the execution commands propagated through the remote servers. To ensure absolute legal protection, I generated an automated hash of the entire transaction and sent a short, automated notice to a third-party legal evidence vault. The log simply stated my actions were taken strictly to prevent the unauthorized transfer of disputed intellectual property and to protect the acquiring party from fraudulent technical certifications. I was not a disgruntled employee burning the house down. I was the architect pulling the fire alarm. I leaned back in the plastic hospital chair and closed the laptop. The sterile white lights of the hallway reflected off the brushed metal casing. I looked up at the wall clock ticking above the nurse's station. It was exactly 3 minutes past midnight. The hospital was completely silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of a distant monitor. Miles Henshaw and his board of directors were likely sleeping soundly in their sprawling suburban estates, dreaming of their massive bonuses and the victory laps they would take in the morning. They had absolutely no idea that they had just crossed an invisible tripwire. They were about to wake up to a world where their most valuable, world-changing asset would refuse to listen to a single command they gave it. And it would stand perfectly, immovably still. Not because I was vindictive, but simply because they had tried to steal something that was never theirs to take. While I sat by my father's bedside in the intensive care unit, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest under the thin hospital blanket, my phone began to vibrate against the plastic armrest of my chair. It was 6 in the morning. I did not need to look at the screen to know what was happening 30 miles away. The automated system alerts were rolling in, followed almost immediately by frantic text messages from my lead engineer on the operations floor. The dominoes I had carefully aligned the night before were finally beginning to tip over. Through the chaotic, breathless updates from my loyal team, I watched the execution of my protocol unfold exactly as designed. At exactly 6:15 in the morning shift supervisor at Halbrecht Mobility Systems attempted to initialize the daily routing matrix. This was supposed to be a historic morning. They were scheduled to push the massive integration update, syncing our servers with Marrow Vale Transport Group to prepare for the final signatures that afternoon. At first glance, everything appeared normal. The system smoothly dispatched the existing fleet. The trucks currently rolling down Interstate 10 kept moving. The warehouses continued their standard loading procedures. But the moment the supervisor tried to execute the command to open a new commercial route, the system hit a concrete wall. The command was rejected. The integration keys failed to authenticate. Across the massive digital map on the main wall of the operations center, all projected expansion zones flashed a stark, unyielding red. Then, the master dashboard locked down, displaying a single cold line of text in bold font. Commercial expansion disabled pending ownership and compliance verification. By 7:30 in the morning, the executive war room on the 42nd floor was a scene of highly controlled chaos. Miles Henshaw stormed into the glass-walled room, his face a mottled mask of rage and disbelief. He had likely been practicing his victory speech in the mirror just an hour prior. Now, he was staring at a monitor that refused to yield to his authority. He slammed his briefcase onto the mahogany table and began barking orders at the infrastructure team. "Override it right now," Miles shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Bypass the compliance layer and force the integration keys through. We are signing a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars in exactly 6 hours. I want this system greenlit immediately." My lead engineer stood his ground at the end of the table. "We cannot override it, Miles," he stated firmly. "It is not a system glitch. It is a hard-coded legal restriction protocol. The core engine has shifted into a locked state because the compliance hash does not match the ownership registry. The system explicitly states that only the acting escrow counsel and the registered inventor of record have the cryptographic authority to authorize a restoration." Dana Pike, the chief integration officer, paced frantically near the window. She pointed an accusing finger at the screen. "Cassidy did this," Dana hissed, her voice venomous. "She planted a logic bomb before she walked out yesterday. She deliberately sabotaged the company infrastructure to hold the acquisition hostage, get security to seize her company assets, and have the legal team draft a termination letter." The engineering team did not flinch. They pulled up the master access logs and projected them onto the main screen for the entire room to see. "There is no logic bomb, Dana," the the lead engineer explained, his tone laced with a quiet, vindictive satisfaction. "We have audited the entire codebase. There is zero evidence of malicious access. No data has been deleted. No unauthorized code has been injected. Cassidy did not break the system. The system is working exactly as it was legally contracted to work. It detected a discrepancy in the ownership filing, and it protected itself." The reality of the situation hit the room like a physical blow. Before Miles could formulate another desperate command, the speakerphone in the center of the table buzzed. It was the lead merger and acquisition attorney representing Marrow Vale Transport Group. The buyer had just received the automated alert from the escrow firm. The voice on the other end of the line was devoid of any corporate warmth. "Miles, we have a catastrophic problem," the attorney said. "Yeah. We just received formal notice from the Independent Escrow Council. They have frozen the transfer of the core routing engine. We are being informed that the intellectual property you claimed as a 100% company-owned asset is currently under severe legal dispute regarding unauthorized use and misrepresentation of ownership. We are pausing the signing ceremony immediately." In the span of 2 hours, the most lucrative transaction in Halbrecht history evaporated. A deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars shifted violently from pending completion to entirely frozen pending a massive fraud investigation. The executives in the war room suddenly realized they were standing on a trapdoor. If this deal collapsed, the company valuation would plummet. Their massive multi-million-dollar equity bonuses would instantly vanish. Worse still, if Marrow Vale decided to walk away entirely, they would inevitably sue Halbrecht for gross misrepresentation and breach of faith. Desperation makes arrogant men careless. Miles turned to Wes Talbot, the general counsel, who was sweating profusely in his tailored suit. "Open an internal investigation right now," Miles commanded, jabbing a finger in Wes's direction. "I want you to dig through every single email, every server log, and every piece of communication Cassidy has sent in the last 6 months. Look for the keywords retaliation and sabotage. We need to build a narrative that she went rogue. We have to control the internal public opinion before the board of directors finds out what is happening." Wes scrambled back to his office and mobilized his legal team to hunt for my digital fingerprints. He desperately hoped to find a smoking gun he could use to destroy my credibility. But the deeper the legal team dug into the server logs, the harder it became to maintain the lie. They did not find evidence of my treason. They found the undeniable, time-stamped proof of their own. A junior paralegal walked into Wes's office, carrying a printed stack of audit trails. She placed them quietly on his desk. The logs were damning. They clearly showed that the metadata timestamp on the intellectual property addendum had been manually altered to appear as though it had been filed days ago, rather than slipped in at the last possible second. More devastatingly, the network logs proved that my obsolete authentication token had been reactivated against all standard security protocols, bypassing two-factor authentication, entirely through an executive override command issued from Miles Henshaw's own terminal. Furthermore, several critical compliance warnings regarding the escrow agreement had been manually muted by Dana Pike just 48 hours prior. Wes Talbot stared at the papers, the color completely draining from his face. They could not frame me for sabotage because the system logs proved, unequivocally, that the executive team were the ones who had actively tampered with the corporate record. The cover-up had completely fallen apart before it even began. By noon, the silence in the corporate headquarters had transformed into a low, pervasive hum. The news of the frozen acquisition could not be contained. The rank-and-file employees, the developers, the project managers, and the logistics coordinators were all watching the red dashboard errors. They were reading the automated compliance messages. They saw the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from the executive suites. For the first time in 3 years, the carefully constructed illusion of corporate supremacy shattered. The employees gathered in break rooms and stairwells, exchanging hushed, fearful conversations. They finally began to whisper the one question that Miles Henshaw feared more than anything else in the world. If Cassidy really walks away, a junior developer whispered to his team lead in the hallway, do we actually own what we think we own? Sitting in the hospital, reading the text messages from my team, I allowed myself a small, cold smile. Harbor Glass had stopped exactly where I intended it to stop. By 1 in the afternoon, the corporate hemorrhaging could no longer be contained within the executive suite. The internal investigation that Miles Henshaw had desperately launched to frame me for sabotage had backfired with spectacular precision. Instead of burying me, his frantic demands for audit trails had triggered an automatic escalation protocol to the highest oversight body in our corporate structure. The board of directors intervened, and they summoned the one person the executive team feared more than the Securities and Exchange Commission. They brought in Lenora Vale. Lenora was the chairwoman of the Special Governance Committee. She was a woman who had spent 40 years dismantling corrupt corporate structures, possessing a mind like a steel trap and a clear disdain for executives who used the excuse of business velocity to mask their own legal negligence. She did not operate on panic. She operated on documentation. The emergency board session was convened in the main glass-walled conference room. Lenora sat at the absolute head of the long mahogany table. Miles, Dana, and Wes were seated along the side, looking less like powerful corporate leaders and more like defendants at a tribunal. I was not in the room, of course. I was still sitting in the surgical waiting area of Redstone Memorial Hospital, but the beauty of a modern, heavily surveilled corporate network is that secrets do not exist if you know the right people in middle management. I was receiving a real-time encrypted transcript of the proceedings from a secure proxy. Lenora did not begin the session by asking about me. She did not ask why the system was locked or how much money the company was losing by the minute. She opened her leather-bound portfolio, looked directly over her reading glasses at the three executives, and asked a single, paralyzing question. Who in this room can prove to me that Halbrecht Mobility Systems owns Harbor Glass, without asking me to rely on your blind faith? The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Miles opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Wes Talbot shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie. Dana Pike stared at her notepad. None of them could answer immediately because they all knew the radioactive truth that the digital forensics had just unearthed. Every single document, every memo, and every formal declaration asserting full, unencumbered corporate ownership of my core engine had been hastily manufactured within the last 6 weeks. Prior to that 6-week window, the paper trail was a vast, barren desert. Then, the final nail in their coffin was delivered quietly, not by a high-priced auditor, but by a mid-level employee they had stepped on one too many times. Leah Brandt was a senior records manager. 2 months prior, Dana had unceremoniously iced Leah out of the merger integration team to keep the circle of knowledge impossibly tight. Dana thought Leah was invisible, but Leah had access to the deep archives. While Wes Talbot's legal team was busy trying to find evidence of my treason, Leah quietly compiled a master dossier and bypassed the entire executive chain of command, submitting it directly to Lenora's committee. Through the secure proxy, I read the summary of what Leah had surrendered. It was the complete, unaltered archive of my communications over the past 3 years. It contained dozens of carefully worded emails where I requested the finalization of the intellectual property carve-out. It held the calendar invites for meetings regarding my deferred equity, all of which had been declined or rescheduled by Miles. It was an undeniable mountain of evidence proving that they had deliberately strung me along, delaying their contractual obligations until the very moment they could sell my work to the highest bidder. Lenora began reading the audit trail aloud to the room, her voice devoid of any warmth. The investigation peeled back their lies layer by agonizing layer. First, she addressed Dana Pike. The system logs showed explicit time-stamped instructions from Dana to the junior legal staff, ordering them to quietly alter the language in the intellectual property exhibit. She had instructed them to change the phrase licensed core engine to company-owned proprietary asset. Next, Lenora turned her focus to Wes Talbot. The general counsel had built his career on protecting the company. but the archives revealed his complicity. There were flagged emails showing that junior compliance officers had explicitly warned Wes about the massive material risk of claiming ownership without a finalized buyout agreement. Wes had replied to those warnings with a brief, damning instruction. Proceed with current language. Pending later cleanup. He had gambled the entire acquisition on the hope that I would be too weak to fight back before the closing date. But the most devastating revelation, the true motive behind the entire catastrophic mess, belonged to Miles Henshaw. Lenora projected a private, heavily encrypted email exchange between Miles and the chief financial officer onto the boardroom screen. In it, Miles was aggressively demanding that they push the Merrow Vale signing ceremony to close before the end of the third quarter. The language was desperate and forceful. The governance committee had pulled Miles's compensation structure to understand why. The answer was raw greed. His multi-million-dollar change of control bonus, a payout that would secure his generational wealth, was entirely dependent on finalizing the transaction before the 30th of the month. If the deal slipped into the fourth quarter, his bonus multiplier dropped by 50%. He was willing to commit corporate fraud simply to hit a personal financial deadline. And then, the final, sickening twist of the knife was revealed. The committee had demanded access to the buyer's side of the data room to understand the scope of the damage. In doing so, they uncovered a preliminary post-merger integration document drafted by the leadership at Merrow Vale. The acquiring company did not just want to purchase the Harbor Glass software. They clearly understood the value of the mind that built it. The buyer's organizational chart had specifically designated a massive new role for the post-acquisition entity. They intended to appoint me as the global head of systems integration. Miles had intercepted that document. The audit logs showed he had spent the last 2 weeks actively trying to negotiate my name off that chart. He wanted to remove me from the equation entirely, aiming to absorb the new global compliance division under his own operational control after the merger was complete. Sitting in the hospital, reading that final detail on my screen, the full truth finally clicked into place. The horrific events of the previous morning were no longer just a display of toxic management. Denying me the 72 hours of leave to be with my dying father was not merely an act of extreme, inhumane callousness. It was the crucial, calculated final step in a premeditated ambush. Miles knew that if the deal closed and the buyer took over, I would be elevated to a position of untouchable power, and the truth about the intellectual property would immediately surface during the transition. He needed me silenced, stripped of my assets, and pushed out of the company before the ink dried. He saw my father's ruptured aneurysm not as a tragedy, but as the perfect leverage. He used my fear for my father to try to force a signature that would legalize the theft and erase my future. Back in the boardroom, Lenora Vale closed her leather portfolio. The gentle thud echoed in the silent room. She looked at the 3 executives, her expression radiating absolute disgust. This committee has reached a preliminary conclusion based on the immutable data presented, Lenora stated, her words sharp and final. This situation is not the result of a rogue employee launching a retaliatory strike against the company infrastructure. What we are looking at is a coordinated effort by the executive board to systematically misappropriate intellectual property, forge compliance documentation, and legalize the theft of value created by a senior director. You did not protect the company, you placed a target on its back. The investigation was no longer about how to fire me. The crosshairs had completely reversed. The only question left for the board was how to surgically remove the cancer in the executive suite before the acquiring company decided to burn Halbrecht to the ground. The afternoon sun cast long, sterile shadows across the linoleum floor of the post-operative recovery ward. My father was finally out of surgery, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, steady rhythm beneath a thin white blanket. The surgeon had told me the procedure was successful, but the next 24 hours were critical. I sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside his bed, listening to the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. It was a grounding sound, a sharp contrast to the digital bloodbath I knew was currently tearing through the corporate headquarters. My phone vibrated against my leg. I pulled it from my pocket and checked the screen. For the past 6 hours, my screen had been flooded with panicked messages from middle management and frantic missed calls from Miles and Dana. I had ignored every single one of them. But this incoming call was different. The caller identification did not display the name of the chief operating officer or the general counsel. It displayed the direct office line of Lenora Vale, the chairwoman of the Special Governance Committee. The power dynamic had officially flipped. The executive team had lost control of the narrative, and the board of directors was now stepping in to contain the blast radius. I swiped the screen to answer and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited. "Cassidy, this is Lenora Vale," the voice on the other end said. Her tone was measured, lacking the frantic desperation that had characterized every communication from the company that morning. "I am calling to discuss the current operational freeze on the harbor glass architecture." A younger version of myself might have started defending my actions, offering apologies for the inconvenience, or begging for my job back. But sitting beside my unconscious father, having survived the sheer, calculated cruelty of the morning, I had absolutely no apologies left to give. I was done playing defense. "Lenora," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional tremor. "Before we proceed, I need to establish the parameters of this conversation. I will not engage in any private, off-the-record discussions. If you want to talk about the software, I require the Independent Governance Committee to be present on this line, along with the lead acquisition attorneys representing Merrow Vale Transport Group. I will hold while you merge the calls." There was a brief, heavy pause on the line. Lenora was not used to being dictated to by a senior director, but she was smart enough to recognize a woman who held all the leverage. "Understood," she said simply. 2 minutes later, the line clicked, and a faint static hiss filled the background. Lenora announced that the requested parties were now listening on a secure conference bridge. The most powerful people involved in a transaction worth hundreds of millions of dollars were waiting in absolute silence for me to speak. "Let me be entirely clear," I began, my words sharp and methodical. "Harbor Glass is not, and never has been, an unconditionally owned asset of Halbrecht Mobility Systems. It is a proprietary architecture that I created independently. The company was granted a conditional license to utilize the software. That license explicitly dictates that if the company intends to use Harbor Glass in any transaction involving a change of control, they are legally obligated to publicly disclose the true ownership status to the acquiring entity and fulfill all deferred equity obligations to the registered inventor of record." I paused, letting the legal reality settle over the listeners. Instead of honoring that contract, the executive team attempted to quietly rewrite the intellectual property exhibits. They deliberately concealed the deferred equity and tried to reclassify my work as a company-owned asset to inflate the valuation of the merger. "Cassidy," the lead attorney for Merrow Vale interrupted, his voice tight with concern. "The data room contains a technical certification verifying the system architecture, and that document bears your digital authorization. Are you claiming you signed a document you did not agree with?" "I am claiming I never signed it," I shot back, my voice slicing through the static. "I refused to sign any documentation this morning. If you review the forensic audit trails I submitted to the Escrow Council, you will see exactly how that certification was forged. The system logs prove that an executive override command was used to resurrect a deprecated security token attached to my name. Someone in that building purposely reactivated a dead token to ghost sign the technical release, creating the fraudulent illusion that I supported the integration parameters." A collective, stifled breath echoed over the conference line. I had just laid out a clear, undeniable case of corporate fraud. I was not just accusing them of breaking a promise. I was proving that they had actively manipulated digital records to deceive a publicly traded buyer. Lenora Vale finally broke the silence. Her voice was stripped of any corporate diplomacy. She asked the one question that was undoubtedly burning in the minds of everyone in the boardroom. "Cassidy, are you doing this to tear this company down? Are you trying to destroy this transaction out of spite?" I looked at my father. his face pale against the hospital pillows. I thought about the years I had sacrificed, the late nights, the missed holidays, and the absolute humiliation of being told my family did not matter. But my response was not fueled by anger. It was fueled by an unshakable adherence to the truth. "No," I answered, my tone causing the entire line to fall dead silent. "I am stopping a fraud from being successfully stamped." Then, I delivered the final, devastating twist that I had kept buried for months. It was the piece of information that would completely shatter any remaining illusion that Miles and Dana were victims of a difficult employee. If the executive team truly wanted clean ownership of Harbor Glass, they could have had it half a year ago, I stated cleanly. 6 months ago, I presented a comprehensive buyout agreement to Miles Henshaw and Dana Pike. I was fully prepared to sign over the complete rights to the core engine. All I asked in return was the immediate vesting of my promised equity and a formalized commitment regarding my leadership role in the post-merger integration phase. I drafted the papers myself. I let the weight of that revelation sink in. They rejected it. They refused to vest the equity because they did not want to dilute their own bonus pools. They refused the leadership mandate because they wanted to maintain absolute operational control after the acquisition. They did not want to pay me what I was owed, and they did not want to share the power. They thought they could simply starve me out, wait until the final hour, and force me to surrender my leverage for free. The implications were catastrophic for the executives. Miles and Dana had not been caught off guard by a sudden, malicious technical lockdown. They had actively engineered the collapse of the deal through their own unchecked greed. They had held a viable, legal path to success in their hands 6 months ago, and had crushed it simply because they wanted a larger slice of the pie. Their last-minute attempt to force my signature while my father was being rushed into surgery was not just inhumane, it was the desperate, sloppy culmination of a theft they had been planning for a year. "What are your immediate terms?" Cassidy, the lead attorney for Marrow Vale, asked cautiously. "What financial figure is required to lift the restricted compliance mode today?" They expected a ransom demand. They expected me to throw out a massive monetary figure, leveraging the frozen system for an immediate, extortionate payout. They still did not understand how I operated. "I am not asking for a blind wire transfer," I replied coldly. "I am not looking for a quick settlement to make this go away. My demands are structural. First, I require a formal or recorded hearing with the full board of directors, the acquiring partners, and the external auditors. Second, I demand that every single claim I have made today be meticulously minuted and cross-referenced against every internal email, every documented file version, and every digital timestamp on the company servers." I leaned back in my chair, watching the steady green line on my father's heart monitor. I was no longer fighting a chaotic defensive battle. I was dictating the terms of their surrender. "I want the absolute truth of this transaction laid bare on the official record," I concluded, my voice steady and controlled. "Once the board acknowledges the reality of the ownership structure, and once the individuals responsible for the fraudulent certifications are held accountable, then we can discuss the financial terms of a new licensing agreement. Until then, Harbor Glass remains frozen." I ended the call and let the silence return to the hospital room. This was not impulse. It was a controlled dismantling of everything they had built on a lie. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the post-operative recovery room. I sat in the dim, artificial light, watching the steady rise and fall of my father's chest beneath the thin hospital blanket. In the quiet hours of the late afternoon, the adrenaline that had fueled my precise, calculated strikes against the company began to recede. In its place, a profound, aching exhaustion settled over me. While I waited for the anesthesia to wear off, I thought about the last 3 years of my life. I thought about the countless nights I had stayed awake until 2 in the morning, illuminated only by the harsh glare of dual monitors. I remembered missing my aunt's funeral and my cousin's wedding because the server infrastructure was unstable. I had operated under the naive, fundamentally flawed belief that if I was simply good enough, if I worked hard enough, and proved my undeniable value to the company, I would eventually be treated with fairness and respect. I had believed that absolute competence was a shield against exploitation. My phone screen lit up on my lap with another encrypted update from my proxy inside the boardroom. The governance committee was still in session, and Leah Brandt was not finished dismantling the executive team. She had just submitted a newly unearthed email thread to Lenora Vale. It was an exchange from 8 months ago between Miles Henshaw and the head of human resources regarding my potential elevation to a vice president role. I had essentially been doing the job of a vice president for a year and a half, managing global risk profiles while architecting the very software that was about to make them rich. Miles had explicitly vetoed the promotion. His written justification stared back at me from my phone screen. Cassidy is too valuable to promote out of operational dependence. The absolute cruelty of those words took the breath right out of my lungs. He did not deny me a promotion because I was lacking in skill or leadership qualities. He denied it because I was too useful in the trenches. He had intentionally kept me grinding at the operational level, weighed down by endless, critical responsibilities but starved of actual executive power. He wanted my brain, but he did not want to give me a seat at the table where the money was divided. A second document followed Leah's initial email. It was a formal meeting minute from a closed-door strategy session regarding the merger. Dana Pike had been the one to draft the strategy on how to handle my outstanding deferred equity. Her documented recommendation was chillingly simple. She proposed to the board that they wait until after the change of control is done to handle Cassidy's claims. It was a polite, sanitized corporate way of saying they intended to cash out my life's work, finalize the merger, hand the company over to the buyers, and then completely ignore the promises they made to me when my services were no longer required. The transcript from the boardroom showed that the pressure was finally breaking the unified front of the executives. Wes Talbot, sweating under the immense weight of the governance committee and desperate to save his own law license, cracked under Lenora's relentless questioning. He formally admitted on the record that he had warned both Miles and Dana against their actions. He confessed that using the exact phrase, company-owned proprietary engine, in the official data room, without a finalized buyout agreement or a clear chain of title, constituted a severe material misrepresentation. He knew it was illegal. He knew it was a lie. But he allowed it to proceed anyway because Miles had threatened his position, and he chose his own salary over his ethical obligations as general counsel. Cornered and completely stripped of his usual arrogance, Miles attempted to defend his actions with the tired, pathetic rhetoric of executive burden. Every leader has to make tough decisions, Miles argued to the committee, his voice recorded in the proxy transcript. We were looking at a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The entire future of this enterprise was on the line. I had to prioritize the survival and growth of the company over the personal convenience and emotional state of one employee. Lenora Vale did not let him finish. Her response was a masterclass in moral evisceration. This was not a tough decision, Miles, Lenora fired back, her words cutting through his defense like a scalpel. Tough decisions are about market positioning and resource allocation. What you did was look at a woman whose father was suffering a massive hemorrhage, and you saw a tactical opportunity. You used a profound family crisis. You weaponized her absolute personal terror to force her to sign away an intellectual asset you were simply too cheap to buy legally. That is not leadership. That is extortion. Reading Lenora's words, the final, defensive wall around my heart crumbled. The most painful truth of this entire ordeal did not reside in the breach of a licensing contract, the theft of deferred equity, or the fraudulent technical certifications. The true, agonizing wound was the motive behind it all. What hurt the most was not that Miles denied my request for 72 hours of leave. It was the horrific realization that they had looked at me in my most vulnerable, desperate state, and instead of seeing a human being in pain, they saw a crowbar. They saw my panic over my dying father and chose to exploit it to line their own pockets. A weak, dry rustling sound pulled my attention away from the phone. I looked up. My father's eyes were fluttering open. The harsh anesthesia was still holding him down, making his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. but he was conscious. I immediately dropped my phone onto the chair and leaned over the metal rail of the bed, taking his frail, warm hand in both of mine. "Cassidy," he breathed, his voice barely a rasp against the plastic oxygen tube resting under his nose. He looked at me, his eyes tired but clear, recognizing the hospital room and my face hovering above him. He squeezed my fingers with what little strength he had left. "You are still here." I nodded, blinking back the sudden, hot burn of tears that I had refused to shed all day. "I am right here, Dad. I am not going anywhere." He offered a faint, crooked smile. He looked at my face, perhaps seeing the exhaustion and the lingering shadow of the corporate war I was fighting. "Your mother," he whispered, pausing to take a shallow, deliberate breath. "Your mother always used to say, 'Never sign away what you built just because someone made you feel small.'" The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was as if my mother was standing right there in the sterile hospital room, reaching across time and memory to hand me the exact armor I needed. For the past 12 hours, I had been operating purely on cold logic, deploying legal mechanisms and technical locks to defend myself, but my father's whisper shifted the very axis of my fight. I was no longer battling just to keep my job, or to secure my vesting schedule, or to punish the men who had wronged me. I was fighting to protect the fundamental truth of my own value. I was fighting because I refused to let people who lacked basic human decency dictate the worth of what I had created. They had tried to make me feel small, hoping I would simply shrink away and surrender. I was never going to shrink again. My phone vibrated one last time against the plastic seat of the chair. It was an official company-wide calendar invitation initiated directly by Lenora Vale. The subject line read simply, "Final Governance and Acquisition Review." The mandatory guest list included the entire board of directors, the senior executive partners from Merrow Vale Transport Group, the external corporate auditors, and the key leadership team of Halbrecht Mobility Systems. It was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. This was not going to be another closed-door interrogation or a quiet, swept-under-the-rug settlement discussion. Lenora was dragging the entire disaster out into the blinding light of a formal, inescapable hearing. I clicked the screen and accepted the invitation. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. I had roughly 14 hours to prepare for the most important meeting of my professional life. It was a session that I knew would unequivocally decide who was going to lose their seat at the table, who was going to lose their millions, and who was going to lose their face forever. I held my father's hand a little tighter, knowing exactly what I had to do. I logged into the secure video conference from the small, sterile family consultation room just down the hall from the intensive care unit. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, irritating hum. I had not slept in over 24 hours. I wore the same wrinkled blouse from the day before, my hair pulled back into a messy knot, and my face was entirely devoid of makeup. I did not attempt to look polished, nor did I try to project an aura of manufactured tragedy. As my video feed snapped onto the massive wall monitor inside the Halbrecht executive boardroom, I simply stared directly into the camera. My absolute icy stillness seemed to unsettle the room far more than any screaming fit of rage ever could have. The boardroom was packed. Lenora Vale sat at the head of the table, flanked by the Independent Governance Committee. To her left sat the senior partners from Merrow Vale Transport Group, looking incredibly grim. To her right were Miles Henshaw, Dana Pike, and Wes Talbot, completely stripped of their usual corporate swagger. Lenora did not waste time with introductions. She picked up a remote and pressed a button, projecting a massive digital timeline onto the screen beside my face. It was a minute-by-minute autopsy of the previous day's catastrophe. "We are going to review the chronology of yesterday morning," Lenora announced, her voice echoing through the hospital speakers on my laptop. At 8:15, Cassidy Edwards received a call from Redstone Memorial. At 8:20, she requested an emergency family leave of absence. At 8:25, that request was denied, and she was pulled into a secondary meeting where she was pressured to sign an intellectual property surrender. At 8:40, A technical certification was uploaded to the buyer data room using a revoked authentication token. At exactly 3 minutes past midnight, the escrow counsel received a formal dispute notice. Miles Henshaw leaned forward, his face flushed with a desperate, defensive anger. He knew he was drowning, but he was going to thrash until the very end. "Look at the timeline, Lenora," Miles pleaded, gesturing wildly at the screen. "Look at the exact timestamp of the system lockdown." She waited for the perfect moment. She held on to this supposed dispute until the midnight before the signing ceremony to maximize the damage. She weaponized this situation to extort the company. She was just waiting to squeeze us. I did not even have to open my mouth to defend myself. A quiet voice from the back of the boardroom did it for me. Leah Brandt, the mid-level records manager who had blown the whistle, stood up and distributed a new stack of manila folders to the committee. "That is factually incorrect, Miles," Leah stated firmly. "Please refer to Exhibit D in your packets. 3 weeks ago, Cassidy submitted a formal ticket to the legal department and the executive team, explicitly requesting that the ownership files in the data room be corrected to reflect the actual licensing agreement. I have the delivery receipts. She did not wait for the last minute to squeeze the company. She tried to fix it weeks ago, and you intentionally ignored her." Miles snapped his mouth shut, his face draining of color. The Marrow Vale attorneys scribbled furiously on their legal pads. Dana Pike saw Miles go down and instantly tried to detach herself from the sinking ship. "I was only acting on operational directives," Dana stammered, smoothing down the lapels of her suit jacket. "My integration team was under immense pressure to finalize the exhibits. I simply consolidated the paperwork. I was just cleaning up the language for brevity. I had no malicious intent to alter the ownership status." Lenora looked over her glasses at the chief integration officer. "You call it cleaning up the language for brevity, Dana, because the digital forensic team pulled the metadata on the specific file in question." Lenora tapped the table with her pen. "The audit trail shows you manually highlighted the phrase licensed core engine and directly typed over it with the phrase company-owned engine. That is not formatting for brevity. That is active, deliberate falsification of a legal asset description." Dana shrank back into her leather chair, completely silenced. Wes Talbot was the last executive left exposed. He adjusted his glasses, sweat beading on his forehead. "I am the general counsel," Wes began, his voice trembling slightly. "My primary duty is to facilitate the business objectives of the executive board. I was placed under severe business pressure from the chief operating officer to push the documents through to meet the end-of-quarter deadline. I signed off on the filings under duress." "Do not play the victim, Wes," Lenora interrupted coldly. She projected another slide onto the main screen. It was an email Wes had sent to his private legal counsel 2 weeks prior. "In this message, you explicitly state that claiming full ownership of Harbor Glass without executing the deferred equity buyout could constitute a material misrepresentation. You understood the exact legal risk from the very beginning, yet you remained entirely silent. You traded your ethical obligations for the promise of a successful acquisition bonus." The lead representative from Marrow Vale Transport Group finally leaned into his microphone. His expression was a mask of pure corporate fury. "Let me make something abundantly clear to this entire room," the representative said, glaring directly at Miles. "If this truth had been hidden from us for another 24 hours, and we had signed those closing documents based on your fraudulent certifications, we would not just be terminating this transaction today. We would be handing this entire file over to the federal civil enforcement agencies. You are about to make us complicit in a multi-million-dollar fraud." The weight of the threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The executives had completely run out of lies. They had run out of scapegoats. It was at this precise moment that I delivered the final, fatal strike. I leaned closer to the camera, ensuring every person in that boardroom had to look me in the eyes. "There is one final document that was not included in the primary data room audit," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the boardroom. "When I joined Halbrecht Mobility Systems 3 years ago, I did not just receive a verbal promise regarding my deferred equity, I knew better than to trust a handshake. I held up a single, aged piece of paper to my laptop camera. This is an internal memorandum drafted on my first day of employment, signed by the previous board of directors before the current executive team took control. It officially approves the principal grant of my equity shares upon any change of control event. It explicitly outlines my ownership stake in the core architecture. My unvested equity is a minuted, legally binding promise. It is not a casual detail that Miles and Dana simply misremembered. It is a documented debt. A visible shockwave rippled across the massive mahogany table. The sudden realization hit every single person in the room simultaneously. The narrative had just shifted drastically. This was no longer just a hearing to clear my name. This was no longer just about proving that I was right and the executives were corrupt. Because I held the original carve-out, and because I now presented irrefutable proof of the board-approved principal grant, the definition of taking everything back expanded exponentially. If the governance committee sided with me, I was not just going to get an apology. I possessed the legal leverage to take back my senior director title, force the immediate vesting of my massive equity shares, reclaim my unquestionable ownership of the Harbor Glass architecture, and step right into the incredibly powerful strategic leadership position that the acquiring company had designed for me. I was poised to take the very power, wealth, and status that Miles and Dana had tried to steal from me. The silence that followed was absolute. The executives stared at the screen, entirely paralyzed by the magnitude of what they were about to lose. Lenora Vale slowly closed her leather-bound portfolio. She did not offer a smile, nor did she offer a declaration of victory. She understood the immense gravity of the decision resting on her shoulders. The governance committee has reviewed all testimonies and the immutable evidence presented, Lenora announced, her voice neutral and impossible to read. We are suspending this open session. The independent board members will now move into a closed executive session to deliberate. A final decision regarding the termination of the executives, the restructuring of the intellectual property, and the future of Cassidy Edwards at this company will be delivered in exactly 20 minutes. The screen went black as the boardroom feed was cut. I sat back in the uncomfortable hospital chair, staring at the dark monitor of my laptop. The tension in my chest tightened until it felt like a physical band of iron. The trap had been sprung, the truth had been entirely exposed, and the men who had tormented me were completely cornered, but Lenora had not given me a definitive answer. I had 20 agonizing minutes to wait, suspended in an absolute void, not knowing if I was about to walk away with everything I had ever built, or if I would only walk away with the hollow comfort of knowing I was right. Those 20 minutes felt like wading through an ocean of deep, freezing water. I sat completely still in the sterile hospital family room, my eyes locked on the blackened screen of my laptop. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system overhead. I had laid every single card on the table. I had exposed the fraudulent technical certifications, the altered intellectual property exhibits, and the sheer, unadulterated greed that had driven the executive team to weaponize my father's medical emergency. I had nothing left to say and nothing left to hide. Suddenly, the video feed clicked back to life. The massive boardroom in Dallas materialized on my screen, but the atmosphere had undergone a violent, irreversible shift. The unified front of the executive team was completely shattered. Miles Henshaw and Dana Pike were no longer sitting at the center of the massive mahogany table. They had been physically relocated to the far edge of the room, their faces pale, their postures rigid with the terrifying realization of their own demise. Wes Talbot looked like a man who had just been handed a prison sentence. Lenora Vale sat at the head of the table. She adjusted her glasses, looked directly into the camera lens, and delivered the execution with chilling, administrative precision. Cassidy, the independent board of directors has concluded its executive session, Lenora announced, her voice echoing with absolute authority. Effective immediately, the board has placed Miles Henshaw and Dana Pike on indefinite administrative suspension. pending a full external forensic audit of their actions. Their security clearances have been revoked, and they are barred from the corporate campus. Furthermore, we have accepted the supervised, immediate resignation of Wes Talbot, effectively severing his role as general counsel to mitigate further legal exposure for this corporation. A heavy, incredibly satisfying silence washed over the line. I watched Miles clench his jaw so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He had spent years treating me like an expendable component, and in the span of a single afternoon, he had been reduced to a corporate exile. Regarding the core architecture of the pending acquisition, Lenora continued, opening a fresh legal folder on the table, I am formally announcing to the representatives of Marrow Vale Transport Group that Harborglass is officially reclassified. We acknowledge that the original documentation stands. It is a core asset created by Cassidy Edwards, currently utilized by this company under a conditional license, and it is absolutely not an unconditionally owned corporate asset. Before Lenora could pivot to the next agenda item, the lead attorney for the acquiring company held up his hand. The representative from Marrow Vale leaned over his microphone, looking directly at my face on the projection screen. This was the moment the earth truly shifted beneath my feet. Marrow Vale would like to add a mandatory stipulation to this revised transaction, the lead attorney stated firmly. We have spent the last 3 hours reviewing the forensic data Cassidy provided. She did not just build a brilliant compliance engine, she built a legally impenetrable fortress, and she defended it with absolute integrity when her own leadership attempted to commit fraud. We are buying the value of this system, and that value is intrinsically tied to her capability. Marrow Vale will only proceed with this acquisition if Cassidy Edwards is appointed to directly lead the post-merger compliance technology division. If she walks, we walk. The absolute vindication hit me like a physical wave. For 3 years, Miles had convinced the board that I was simply a highly skilled mechanic, someone to be kept in the dark and worked to the bone. Now, the buyers of a multi-million-dollar enterprise were explicitly stating that I was the most valuable asset in the entire building. Lenora Vale nodded slowly, turning her attention back to the camera. Cassidy, the board is prepared to formally apologize for the egregious misconduct of the suspended executives. We are asking you to outline the terms required to lift the restricted compliance mode so we can save this transaction. They were finally asking for my terms. They expected me to demand a massive, immediate cash settlement to make the pain go away. They still did not understand that this was never simply about the money. It was about taking everything back. I do not want a hollow apology, I replied, my voice perfectly steady, carrying the weight of a woman who had finally stepped into her own power. I am setting 3 final conditions. First, I require an immediate, legally binding addendum acknowledging me as the official, undisputed inventor of record for the Harborglass architecture. Second, I demand the immediate distribution of my deferred equity and the executive bonus that was suspended under the original principal grant. That money is not a negotiation. It is a minuted debt. I paused, thinking of the terrifying moment I stood in that boardroom and was told that family emergencies do not move markets. Third, I continued, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Before I sign a single document, Halbrecht Mobility Systems will draft and enact a mandatory, company-wide emergency family leave policy. It will be carved into the corporate bylaws. No employee in this organization will ever again be forced into a windowless room and told to choose between their livelihood and the life of a dying parent. The boardroom remained utterly silent. I was not just taking my money. I was changing the fundamental rules of the empire that had tried to crush me. Lenora did not hesitate. The board unanimously accepts all 3 conditions, she declared. And we are adding one of our own. The governance committee will be initiating a full clawback of the executive bonuses previously allocated to Miles and Dana. Citing gross misrepresentation and breach of fiduciary duty, I looked at Miles. He stared down at the table, a thoroughly defeated man. He was losing his seat. He was losing his multi-million-dollar payout. And perhaps most devastatingly to his massive ego, he was losing the narrative. He could no longer paint me as a difficult, uncooperative subordinate. The historical record would forever show that he was a thief, and I was the architect who caught him. The restricted compliance mode remains active, I stated, delivering my final instructions. It will only be lifted after every amended document, every board resolution, and the official confirmation from the escrow council are fully signed in the presence of all legal representatives. Once the ink is dry, and the truth is legally binding, I will release the system. When Harbor Glass finally returned to its fully operational state later that evening, the dynamic of the acquisition had completely transformed. The merger was no longer a massive corporate machine designed to swallow me whole and erase my legacy. It became a new structure, a massive new venture where I was stepping through the front doors with my rightful title, my proper ownership share, and unquestionable authority. Later that afternoon, Miles Henshaw packed a single cardboard box under the watchful eyes of building security. He walked to the elevator in absolute silence, stripped of his power and his dignity, exiting the glass tower he had thought he ruled. But my final victory did not take place in a glass-walled boardroom or an executive suite. It happened in the quiet, dim light of a hospital room. I sat in the vinyl chair next to my father's bed. His breathing was stronger now, his color slowly returning as he rested peacefully. My phone vibrated softly in my lap. The screen illuminated, displaying a secure message from the escrow council. All resolutions were signed. The equity transfer was initiated. The transaction was clean. I looked up from the screen and let out a long, trembling breath. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 3 years finally dissolved into the air. I had taken it all back. I finally had the time to sit by my father's side without fear of retribution. I had my name permanently attached to the brilliant architecture I had built from scratch. And most importantly, I had the profound, unshakable peace of knowing that I would never again have to ask a cruel man for permission to be a decent human being. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey of taking the power back, please subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Like this video.